Welcome back, everyone. This week, the topic of discussion will be that absolutely nothing is being priced in when it comes to the cannabis sector and the respective stocks. Yet, the only absence I see is of what's between these people's left and right ear. The quote for today is, "It's not being priced in. Absolutely nothing," end quote. This quote was spoken in regards to rescheduling and the Florida Amendment 3 that would legalize recreational use in Florida. And this quote will be the focus of today's article. Let me ask you this. What's not being priced in? The fact that many of these companies enter into new states, make profits for a couple of quarters to a couple of years, and then subsequently give it all back in the following years after prices normalize? After all, isn't that what many of these companies have historically done? Ultimately, if a company is pursuing a profitless prospect in an attempt to stay relevant, why would its net present value or enterprise value change? Put differently, why would you expect the stock share price to go up? So perhaps these stocks are pricing in more than you want to give credit for, i.e., they're pricing in the past indicating the future, i.e., their profitless endeavors into expansion. I know. For me to posit such an implicitly unflattering question is in and of itself an act of heresy against the orthodox and precepts of the true believers in useful idiots' propaganda. But as I often say, you must question the concepts in a statement as much as the statement itself. In this example, by doing so, we discover the false premise of the quoted phrase, i.e. that nothing is being priced in. Things are being priced in. The fact that the companies are going to make a little money in the short term and then lose it all in the longer term. Let me ask you this. If nothing is being priced in, then why are numerous companies up 100% or more from their lows? Here's a data point. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, recommended the rescheduling of cannabis to Schedule 3 around August 30th, 2023. It would go to reason then that if I were to pull up a chart on these stocks, that they would be flat since then, right? After all, absolutely nothing is being priced in. Yet, if we use MSOS as a proxy for the industry at large, we can see that it's up roughly 65% since that announcement date. And at its height, it was up 135%. Is that nothing, absolutely nothing being priced in? To put that in perspective, MSOS has more than doubled the performance of the NASDAQ and the S&P 500. Is that also nothing? Here's the MSOS up 63%, NASDAQ up 29%, S&P 500 up 25%, roughly speaking. Another phrase I insist upon is we must keep constant our comparisons and control for the variables. This is what's known as being intellectually honest, which is not a common practice among people, let alone the sector's participants. But if we could somehow muster doing that, we would recognize that many of the companies with meaningful exposure to Florida are up more than the average in the sector. Is that merely correlation, or is there a causal link there? If you concede that there is a causal link, then wouldn't the implication of that be that something is being priced in, as opposed to absolutely nothing? As you can tell, today's quoted phrase is largely disingenuous, sensational pablum and manufactured indignation. So there you have it. But there's another angle that's more my style that I want to come at this from. It's not uncommon at all for people to defend patently false statements with the phrase, "what I mean is," or "what they mean is." I've experienced this dynamic many times in my life. Somebody says something sensational, I talk to them about it, they agree that their statement was false, and they agree about the importance of nuance and context. But do you know what almost always happens after that conversation? They immediately go right back to saying the same nonsense that they were saying beforehand. Incredible, isn't it? In the context of today's quote, I believe that he believes what he said, even if it's an exaggerative and emotional statement. This is because the degree of exaggeration is proportional to their emotion and inversely proportional to their concern with objective reality. What he said represents his emotions, and his emotions determine, in large part, what he thinks because his thinking is primarily meant to serve in validating his emotions. This is known as emotional reasoning and is a subset of motivated reasoning. This means that he actually did mean what he said, insofar as you recognize that the phrase he uttered, the quote of today's piece, was a representation of his emotions, not to actually literally interpret it based upon the denotation and definitions of the words he used. Another way of putting it is to say that his emotions on the matter don't accurately reflect reality, because his emotions aren't in accordance with reality, i.e. things being priced in, which is to say that their beliefs, or his beliefs, are fictional, not factual. Simply put, to them, it feels as though nothing is being priced in. See, they could have said that. It feels as though nothing is being priced in. And then, of course, they could have made that statement a little more sophisticated, I know, and said, it feels as though not much is being priced in. And you know, if they said that, this article wouldn't exist. But people just can't speak with honesty, truth, or really any care about any of that. And how they feel about something is as good to them as the actual something, with no concern as to whether their feelings are actually in accordance with reality. Remember, if they said, it feels as though not much is being priced in, this article wouldn't exist, because that statement would be expressing their feelings, and that would be accurate enough and vague and ambiguous enough that you could say that it's well enough reflective of reality. But, like I noted, he didn't say that. So, he did say what he meant because it was his truth. You also have to recognize that although the denotation of his language was false, the subtextual connotation and sentimental implications were true. After all, what could be more real and true than one's feelings? As such, words are merely tools to represent one's emotional landscape. Simply put, it's feels over reals. Or feels equals reals. Actually, to them, it's feels determine what's real. How else do you make sense of such confident nonsense being so commonly propagated across the cannabis sector? How else can you talk about reality, but then say that absolutely nothing is being priced in? Right? That's fictionally speaking of reality, which is to say falsely speaking, which is to say not telling the truth. See, reality prompts these people's feelings. Then they take those feelings and speak of it as though it's reality, oblivious to the fact that that's not the case. Then they speak as though their feelings and reality are interchangeable, as though their feelings perfectly map, reflect, and are proportional to reality. As I mentioned a moment ago, when I went off script, if they said that it feels to me that the market isn't pricing much in, then that would be perhaps, and like I said, vaguely enough, reflecting, mapping, and proportional to reality. But they chose not to go that route. You know, the route of truth and honesty and such matters. People say that pot stocks aren't reflecting the fundamentals. But the so-called fundamentals, rescheduling, Florida turning recreational, haven't even happened yet. But this begs the question as to what fundamental means. Is something that might happen in the future fundamental, i.e. rescheduling? And if so, does that mean that the entire range of possible outcomes are also fundamental, i.e. no rescheduling? But these other fundamentals, you know, the not rescheduling and no Florida recreational use, are seemingly discounted to zero due to their contradictory nature towards that believer's emotions and would invalidate their framework, which, by the way, is merely a post hoc rationalization used to validate and support their emotions. So instead of the potential of no rescheduling setting the potential for rescheduling and thus allowing some degree of rescheduling being priced in, people instead just view it as the potential for rescheduling not being priced in. Now, that's a lot of words, so let's give a simplistic example. A simplistic example of this is if you think that the revenue of TrueLeaf will increase by 400% if Amendment 3 passes and the stock is up 100%, then you could say that the market is pricing in a 25% chance of Amendment 3 passing. Like I said, it's a woefully simplistic example, but it illustrates what I'm talking about. You'd think that the fact that many of these sector participants have failed numerous times at predicting regulatory change would cause them to be humbler in their prognosticating and more aware of probabilistic outcomes. But nope. Another interesting observation is that practically no one can tell me what the stock price should be if it were pricing in Schedule 3. Yet they can somehow tell me that it isn't pricing in Schedule 3. So I might say, if rescheduling happens, what is blank stock worth? And them, it's worth a lot more. Seriously, that's about all you can get out of most people. That's the same evergreen story, by the way, that they've been saying since these stocks have initially listed years ago, half a decade ago. They have no idea about the value, and that's because they're spin artists of narrative. It's best, and I'm sincere about this, this might be the best takeaway of this article. It's best to think of them as financial postmodernists. I plan on writing an article about that, but we'll see what happens. And it's an act of futility to discuss metrics or valuations with a financial postmodernist who's more equivalent to a delusional cheerleader than a consummate investor. And let me remind you, these same pathological personalities have largely thought that it was worth more since time immemorial, and that has caused them to experience disastrous outcomes. But do you think that's dissuaded them? No. Matter of fact, it's seemingly only emboldened them in some sort of perverted victim-bonding fashion. The lesson here? When reality disconfirms your beliefs, silo yourself into an echo chamber. Or, if you're wrong, it's best to exclude the facts that prove you wrong and never consider why or how you were wrong. Which of course presupposes that you acknowledged that you were wrong, but you didn't because, back to step one, silo yourself from those who say that you are wrong. I think we're at a point where these people will finally be right for the first time in half a decade. It seems appropriate to inject such phrases as a broken clock is right twice a day, or even a blind hog can find an acorn from time to time. But they're not going to see it that way. They'll make their necessities virtues. They'll claim all sorts of nice-sounding reasons for why they're being rewarded, and yet personal incredulity and luck won't be contributing factors in their cited reasons. To go off script for a moment, what do I mean by they'll make their necessities virtues? Well, instead of being pathologically persistent when reality is contradicting what it is you believe, i.e. multiple years of the stock falling, upwards collectively of 80%, you don't lie to yourself and say that you're patient and a long-term investor, and that these things are only getting quote-unquote cheaper. You say, I'm neurotic and ideologically pathologized, and as a consequence, that stubbornness will allow me to stomach the downturn and come out on the other side, even though much of this was unnecessary and a consequence of unforced errors. They're not going to say that. So instead they say, I was patient and I bought the dip because I recognized the great opportunity and blah, blah, blah. I was like, well, why did you buy the dip when the EV to sales went from 30 times to 20 times? Like, was that really wise investing decisions? Was that a proper decision-making process? Well, the answer is, well, I'm narrative driven and I don't really understand valuation. So that's why I did it, in part at least. But that, yet again, they'll give you one side of the story and not the other side. and thus they make their necessities virtues. This neurotic fixation with this industry isn't a neurotic fixation that's caused them vast amounts of trouble and problems. No, it's an understanding and patient investor. It's like, okay. The reason this all bothers me is I can already foresee the grandstanding, the I told you so's, the personal incredulity and hubris. And well, I must say, I don't care for that. Matter of fact, that's why I unfollowed numerous people on Twitter back in April when they started running their mouths when the Department of Justice moved to reclassify cannabis. So to summarize things, cannabis stocks are indeed pricing something in, and there's a lot of personally incredulous ideologues out in the world. As a final counterfactual point of proof, if nothing is being priced in, then I'm sure that if rescheduling doesn't occur, then these stocks won't move down on that news, right? After all, absolutely nothing is being priced in, which means that there'll be nothing to price out, right? You would think that after half a decade of people saying nothing is being priced in, that they might reevaluate their statement. But obviously they can't be wrong, so it must be the world instead. I say that sarcastically, but behaviorally that's exactly how they're conducting themselves. Of course, there's no point in bringing this to their attention. They're both too ignorant and too unwilling to ever come to terms with such an ego-invested, narrative-shattering understanding. And why hasn't it dawned on these people that perhaps the multi-year bear market that the cannabis sector experienced, and to some extent is still experiencing, the consequence of overinflated valuations coming in line with the fundamentals of the industry and their respective companies? Wouldn't that imply, at least in part, that the industry is trading on fundamentals for the first time in a long time, if ever? Couldn't the reason that these stocks are off their lows be because the stocks were finally reasonably priced and trading in line with their fundamentals, and thus were able to finally price in some optimism? And wouldn't that fall in line with the capital cycle theory, which is a much broader yet applicable framing of nascent markets, let alone markets in general? I'll let you answer those questions for yourself. Thank you for watching, and until next time.